Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. So happy to be here with you as always. I'm your host, Mark Ohrenberger, and I am here today for another one of our book club episodes where we'll be covering the graphic novel Dead Eyes Volume 1, and I have a very special guest today, none other than maybe the man most responsible for whether you love me or hate me. Here he is, my dad, Mr. Kevin Ohrenberger. Kevin, welcome to the show.
It is so great to be here today, your apostleship. Looking forward to this. You've hit my favorite type of book, so I can't wait to get into it.
Oh yeah? What is that as your favorite type of book?
Presidential biographies.
Oh, is that what this is?
Things like that. Oh, did I read it wrong?
Well, maybe it's art, so it's open to interpretation. If you think that's what this was, maybe this was a tribute to the late and great Jimmy Carter. Maybe that's exactly what we had.
I appreciate that. I just want to start out by saying how proud I am of you. I never thought in my life that you would be an apostle. I've had great aspirations for you all along, and I guess my only caution to you is apostles had pretty rough lives and usually ended in a very violent death. So go for it, whatever makes you happy.
Well, I like to think a 21st century apostle maybe has a different glide path through life, or at least the graphic novel kind. And today we are here to talk about a book that I love. This is Dead Eyes, as I mentioned a few moments ago. And to give you the credits on this book, this was written by Gerry Duggan. And for our listeners, you might recall that all the way back on episode 8, we discussed another one of Gerry Duggan's books. He wrote Falling in Love on the Path to Hell. That was on one of our mini episodes. And I had high praise to give to the first few issues of that story as well. And then artist John McCrea. Now, I feel like this is probably a joke he's heard more times than he'd want to hear in his life, but this is not the lead singer from the band Cake. It is, however, the artist who is probably best known for the DC series Hitman from back in the late 90s, which is really a fantastic anti-hero in the world of superhero series. Colors for this book were done by Mike Spicer, letters by Joe Sabino, and it was published by Image Comics. Now, I mentioned this is Volume 1, so there are 4 issues that make up the 4 chapters of this book. They were released between October of 2019 and January of 2020. And there's a Volume 2 of this book called Dead Eyes, the Empty Frames that's going on right now. There was a big long hiatus between when the original series wrapped up in January of 2020 and earlier in 2024 when the first issue of Dead Eyes, the Empty Frames came out. Now this second series is planned for 5 issues. 1 through 3 have already been released, and issues 4 and 5 are scheduled to be released in February and March of next year, respectively. And even though there was a big time gap between the release of Volume 1 and the beginning of Volume 2, we'll talk a little bit about Volume 2 when we get to that point in our episode that we're wrapping up Volume 1, and you'll see that it actually flows really smoothly right from one into the next. So, Dad, in just a second, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your overall impressions of the book. But first, I want to give listeners just a little bit of an idea of what this story is all about. And so let me read just the first paragraph of the synopsis that appears on the back cover of Volume 1. It says, Dead Eyes was a prolific stick-up man and a hoodlum in Boston in the 1990s, until he took down one last big score and skipped town. Or did someone take him out permanently? Nobody ever discovered the truth. That he retired to live a quiet life with his one true love. But now he's back with a vengeance and wearing his mask again to save her. So it's time we get into it. Dad, first off, I wanted to do this book with you because you are a Boston man. Maybe not these days, and in fact, for listeners, it is New Year's Eve. How I spent my New Year's Eve was with my parents at their home in North Carolina. We had a lovely Italian dinner here earlier, and now you and I are sitting down to talk about this book. But while the Raleigh-Durham area may be your home these days, you grew up in Winthrop, Massachusetts.
That's exactly right. Yeah, just very immediate suburb of Boston. So take the train right there. Very short little ride. So yeah, it's interesting they had the mob involved already. So some of the stereotypes of Boston come through right away.
Yeah, heavy influence of the mob in Boston, and we'll see some of that in this book as well with some of our antagonists that Deadeyes is going to have to deal with. And certainly if you're going to be committing crime in Boston in the 1990s, you're going to be tangled up with some of these folks from time to time.
I found myself reading in the Boston accent, if that helps any, when we got into the Guglielmo guy, or whatever how they saying his name. So some of those stereotypes came through loud and clear for sure.
Yeah, Dad, in my whole life, you have never had a noticeable Boston accent. And I know you've said before that you consciously tried to shake that when you moved out as a young man to Indiana to go to college at Purdue. But anytime we would go to your parents' side of the family or your side of the family, all those aunts and uncles and everybody, dropping the R out of my name, I was Mike. And it is fun to have a setting in a city like Boston. Even though I don't know how much Boston came through necessarily as a character in this, it did feel right as the setting.
It felt right for me, right? So as you said, being familiar with the city and crime in the big city and the mob being involved, it made it very compelling to go forward and read a little bit more about this.
So tell me, overall, what did you think of this book?
So first, it took a while to get used to it, right? I've never read one of these graphic novels before. My career has been in regulations and words are important. So this was very strange to spend, because I heard you talking on your earlier podcast. So despite what you may have said in some of your earlier podcasts, I have enthusiastically supported your efforts here.
I didn't expect you would, and you have, and I appreciate that.
I'm going to correct some of the false things you've spread as we get through this today. I'll kind of weave them in very subtly, of course.
Oh, thanks.
Not used to spending that much time looking at the pictures and trying to draw more of the story out from the pictures. Mm-hmm. And I got confused by some of it.
Okay.
And one of the early pictures, it has that woman. Now, we know who she is. You read the back cover.
Now, Dad, when you say that woman, usually you're referring to my mom.
Well, no, I'm not in this case. No, I'm in the book now. We're not in Boston.
Okay.
No, the wife, it turns out to be the wife of Deadeyes. Mm-hmm. When I first saw it, it started out pretty clever, right? It had the whole, how are we going to tell this backstory to get into it, right? It's TV cut out, episodes and news reports and people in bars telling stories about this mysterious man. But if you look at one of the early pictures of that woman, mm-hmm. she looked mean and kind of hard, right? And I thought, okay, she's going to be a big player in the nastiness of this movie, in this book rather, which ended up, of course, not being the case at all.
Yeah. The very first panel where Deadeyes' wife, Megan, is featured, she has a look of, I don't know if anger is exactly right, but irritation, certainly.
Looks mean.
On her face, yeah. But she ends up being a real sweetheart.
Very big surprise. Sure.
That's true. Well, let me ask this, though. What did you think of Deadeyes as a character? And, by the way, the character's name is Martin Dobbs, but he is known in the world of crime as Deadeyes, particularly for his costume, I guess you could say, or disguise that he wears when committing his crimes. He has a black stocking cap that goes all the way over his face and just has a red X over each eye, which gives him the name Deadeyes, certainly. He wears a Boston Scully cap and full suit with some purple, driving gloves as well on his hands. And so it's it's a distinctive look for a character, for sure. But what did you think of him overall as a character?
Changed my mind several times about him. Just like the wife, who I thought was very, angry and going to be a nasty person in this story. She wasn't. He goes from being talked about as this tremendous criminal, mm-hmm. and then you find out he's actually, working a regular job. And then you find out he's, when he teased you about it, right? He's
sure.
going to go to work, quotes or air quotes around go to work. And I assumed that meant he was going to go right into the crime stuff. Whoops, no, it's not. He's off into some retired state and doing something very much that you would not expect,
right.
from that kind of guy. So yeah, all in all, a very interesting character. He had multiple, and even throughout the rest of the book, he flip-flops back and forth, right? From being a really tender, sensitive guy to being a fairly vicious guy.
Yeah.
And then having, friends and just very layered personality. So I thought that was well done.
Sure. If you had to type him, and he's a character with layers. I think that's a good way to describe it. But if you had to type him, I mean, would you call him, after reading Volume 1, so not knowing whatever you knew coming into the book, but knowing what you know now, Would you call him a hero, an anti-hero? Would you call him a villain? Some of the material, the advertising material for the book, talked about him being a Robin Hood type character, except keeping most of the goods for himself rather than returning them to the poor. Like, where does he fall in your mind? Or is there a character either from television or literature or movies or whatever that like sort of comes to your mind when you think of him?
Yeah, I don't have a character that comes to mind, but what I think of him, you had to be careful with it, right? So you see it on other TV programs that have, murders and things where the character is he's sinister, he's vicious, he's done wrong, so you want to take a very strict interpretation, right? This is not a good guy. And then he does some very humane things. Mm-hmm. You think, maybe he's not such a bad guy. So you have to continually, I found myself catching myself to say, well, wait a minute. This is not, passing out ice cream, to kids, right? He's murdered these people and done this, and he's going to give some of the money to the widow that he's killed and all those kind of things. So, yeah, very complicated person. And, yeah, I guess depending on which page I was on, I had a slightly different perspective, but I kept on finding myself saying, no, wait a minute. No, this isn't right.
I love an anti-hero. And I don't know that Deadeyes cleanly fits into the territory of anti-hero. For me, the first big anti-hero that I really started paying attention to as a storytelling character was Vic Mackey from The Shield. That was the character that Michael Chiklis played, who was a police detective who was sometimes on the side of angels, but also used a lot of police violence and brutality, a lot of manipulation of evidence and the rules of law, and abuse of his badge to get things for himself and his friends and to keep himself out of trouble. And in some ways, you looked at him and you go, okay, well, at the end of the day, he is trying to minimize crime, in large part by taking advantage of his position of the state to commit crime. He was an anti-hero who was more on the side of darkness, right? Even though he wore the badge. And by contrast, you have in Deadeyes a criminal, right? Stated from the beginning, I am a criminal. My job is robbery. And yet, with some of the more charitable things that he does, even though that doesn't seem to be his mission necessarily, it almost places him more on the side of the angels, which is maybe the inverse of a Vic Mackey type character. And I liked that a lot. And yet my feelings about Deadeyes are still complicated at the end. So you mentioned that the way he's introduced in this book is through sort of the television, basically. And let's get into the book, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So the first several pages of this book open with the words of a telecast, and it's from a local Boston news channel right around this time of year, in December of, we're set now in the present day. So, you and I are recording this here at the end of 2024. I guess probably this was being written in late 2019, so it would be around that time that they were thinking for setting this book. And it's one of those stories of looking back on something local of interest from the past. And I just want to read the text of what the news report says, and then we can talk about how on these several pages, while the news report is going on, they're showing different scenes from different settings around the city and people reacting to the news report with their own thoughts on Deadeyes. And so the news report reads, "Tonight we remember Boston's own Deadeyes on the eve of the last known appearance of the masked criminal and hooligan. Was he killed? Double-crossed by one of his accomplices? Or did he retire? Deadeyes was certainly an equal opportunity offender, stealing from banks and drug-dealing criminals. He even once hit Fenway Park. If you were a high-volume cash business, you likely met Deadeyes at least once. The masked man terrorized Bostonians on both sides of the law in the 90s, and he was rumored to have taken down one last score with a cool $10 million. Deadeyes managed to elude a state and federal task force and disappeared completely way back on December 19th, 1997. So that's how Deadeyes is painted in this news story. And going through the different reactions we see, the first setting is like, the bullpen with a bunch of police detectives sitting around, and, they're talking about what they thought of Deadeyes, and, one of them says, good riddance, and another one says, well, at least he made life interesting, like he was a worthy adversary, basically, as a criminal. And then we go down to, looks like a bar, just a local Boston bar, some guys sitting around talking back at the TV, and, one of them starts telling a story about how he saw Deadeyes once, and he was telling a joke as he punched out some guy's teeth. And then, we get some prisoners inside of jail. They're not at all amused by the guy who is on the outside. They don't even care to hear the story. But then we also get a view inside the private office of a mafioso named Don DiGirolamo, who we will deal with again several times over the course of this book.
So that page, Mark, confused me.
Okay.
Because, again, I'm not used to the genre that you're in here. So I'm looking at the little bubbles, reading them, and I see a very dark background
Yes.
on all of the pictures, right? And there's people in them, and there's different things. And the first time, I read it twice.
Yeah.
The first time I read it, I think, okay, it's clearly people talking about them, but I didn't connect those scenes that you just said that are, they're bang, 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 bang right after another, right?
Yeah.
So it's, oh yeah, that is like a bullpen. That is a bar. It has a menu in front and those kind of things. So I didn't quite put all of it together, but I was able from the words to clearly get that there's a lot of different opinions about this guy.
Yeah.
And I thought it was clever how they dropped a little crumb there about $10 million, because I read it to think, okay, he got $10 million. Expecting that to, I had a certain expectation for how that was going to play out in the book. And it played out in the book, but not the way I thought it was going to play out.
Well, that's right. And so when we get to that scene of the office of Don DiGirolamo, and he's reacting to the news story, and they talk about the $10 million, he says $12 million, actually. So even though we're not necessarily introduced to this character by name or by his role at this early stage in the book, we understand this is somebody who's got some insight about that robbery that supposedly was the last big score for Deadeyes before he seemingly just disappeared. Well, we're having all those reactions, and meanwhile, we get this big contrast with what is going on in the actual life of the man under the mask, Deadeyes, Martin Dobbs. And this is where you first meet that character of the wife, Megan, who you mentioned a few minutes ago. She's sitting in a wheelchair in a fairly unglamorous looking apartment. And, she's yelling into another room where Martin is, and we see him for the first time in maybe not his most glorious state.
Fair statement.
He's standing up in the bathroom and he's wiping his rear end, and he's yelling, when they're talking about the where is he now, and he says, whoever had wiping his butt because of his hemorrhoids trying to kill him, was the one who wins the big crown. And we see, this guy didn't just ride off into the sunset and go build a bar on the beach in Mexico and live out his days, but rather, one, he's still right here in town, and two, this doesn't look like a man who took down a $10 million heist. So at this point, we've got to think either he blew that $10 million, he has this long-term plan where he stashed away that $10 million for some point later in his life, or I don't know.
Spent it on toilet paper. I don't know. It was
maybe hemorrhoid treatment is more expensive.
When I saw that page, right, I thought, oh, Mark, you got to be kidding me, right? Am I really going to go through with this book? I'm hoping this isn't the theme of the book. We're going to get these kinds of shots. But frankly, it's like a lot of things in movies, right? We could have taken this out and got a similar introduction to the character.
We could have.
But this was a little, for whatever reason, there it is in all his glory, and away we go.
Well, I'll say this, and we'll get a little sense of this as well in issue number 3, when we're talking about a fight scene that takes place between Deadeyes and a couple of people who happen to be in this building that he's in. Both Gerry Duggan and John McCrea, I think, have a little bit of, I don't know, maybe you could call it a little twist in their sense of humor, or a little bit of appreciation for a shock value kind of panel or page, or something that's just a little over the top. And certainly this is, the first time we see him.
Yeah, nicely said, Mark. Yes,
Right.
It's a little over the top.
And by the way, as always, we will include some pages on our Instagram page at Graphic Novel Apostle with some samples of the artwork. We're not going to be including the page of Martin here dealing with his hemorrhoids.
I'm glad to hear that, just because, I'm glad to hear that. I don't want to go forward with that one too much. But yeah, there it is.
Also, Dad, on that subject, though, of the Instagram page, I should say this. When I started this podcast and had the idea that I would have friends on as guests who aren't comic readers, one of the benefits that I thought of as well is I'll put this episode out each time and promote it to people who see my social media feeds. And then also I would expect that my guest would do the same and share it. And so maybe I'll get different people each episode to listen because of their sphere of influence on social media. And Dad, you have roundly rejected all forms of social media.
I have.
So you're going to be of no benefit to me in this way.
I would say you've probably thought that about a lot of things in our life, right? But no, I don't. Yes, I would not be recommending this to many people. I could clean it up and we could write a story about it. I'm not very good at art. So going back to the wife, I was trying to be very conscious of the pictures because I've heard your prior guests talk about some people actually, like myself, liked words. And others were like, oh no, the pictures tell the story. And I thought, well, all right. I noticed that woman, the wife, had that nasty look on her face. And I'm focused on that. I didn't catch she was in a wheelchair until later on in the story. Then I went back and said, there's a wheelchair there. So I'm definitely missing some of the content the first time through. I did get a bunch more out of it the second time. And I don't know whether that's common for people like yourself that read these types of books for enjoyment. Do you have to go back and reread it and look closely at I'm going to focus on the words this time, then I'm going to focus on the pictures, and then maybe go back a third time and put it all together? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I've learned to assimilate it all on the first read, but I will say this, I always benefit from a second read, and I do that with the comics generally that I'm reading for, not to prepare for a podcast, but just purely for pleasure. I often will go back and reread a second time, and I always come away with something more. Whether that's because I overlooked something in the art or something that I interpreted one way when I first saw it and encountered it, and then having the context of later in the story, I realized it as something more meaningful or just thought of it in a different way. Sure, I do that all the time.
The very next few pages, Mark, if you're going to go on to that.
Yeah.
Those I had to look at several times to say, okay, that's not, it's bouncing back in time, right? So there's reporting about the past and where he is now, and then it comes back to apparently some examples of when he was a bad guy, some of the activity that he was involved with. And I had to look at those and think, well, what's he doing now?
Some of the flashback that we're going to get here comes in Martin's response to the news story. And they have given some examples of some of the colorful capers that Deadeyes was involved in. And Martin just responds, speaking back to his wife, they remember the 90s being more fun than I do. And we get a couple of pages that are then flashback showing Deadeyes in sort of a black and white with punctuated by the red X's for the Deadeyes and blood as well. But we get these pages of showing him in the street running away from something, running toward another fight, punching it out with some guy, himself bleeding at the same time. And, he looks back on his days of Deadeyes not in a glory-filled type way. And I gotta think that if you're that guy sitting in the bar who says he saw Deadeyes tell a joke one time as he was punching out some guy's teeth, you have probably one of two reactions. Either you think, yeah, this guy Deadeyes is a villain, I don't care how he's made out to be in the press, and, he terrorized this poor person whose teeth he punched out. Or you think, boy, that's one bad dude. He's dressed in this cool outfit. He's pulling off these capers and disappearing into the night, and he's joking while he's doing it. And he doesn't seem to think of himself in his own mind as this figure of legend.
Yeah, you talked about that episode where he's punching the guy out. I said, well, what was the joke? Someone asked, right? And he goes, I couldn't tell. All the screaming was going on, basically, right? So it's,
right. Which adds a bit of humor, but at the same time does sort of, remind you that there is something kind of heinous about this.
And here's where we come. I just, going to the next page, if you will. And frankly, so here's my take on this. Now you see a man
20 years later.
So I'm assuming that's the same age as the dude that was in the bathroom.
Yeah. This is present day.
He's clean, he's shaven, he's dressed well, and he's feeding this woman, right? So I really had to go back and look again at that glorious bathroom scene to say, is this the same guy? Or are they introducing a new character?
Yeah.
Because it really doesn't look anything. So it does serve a really good contrast from the prior pages where it had those flashbacks of his very violent actions to here's this guy in a preppy kind of sweater, spoon feeding this woman in a wheelchair. You go, all right. So right away you come up with, this is not just a thug that stayed a thug. He's a thug who has a tender side. Yeah. Or he's a very sweet man who has a little evil side, depending on where you go with it.
Sure. And in a few minutes, when we get to a point where we talk about Deadeyes, and obviously this is inevitable, he's going to be back under the mask as Deadeyes again in the course of this story. But when we first get there, I do want to get your thoughts about what you think Deadeye's motivations are, and whether that's what his motivations were 20 years ago or what his motivations are now. Because I think that's kind of a complicated question too, beyond the obvious money. So as we are now in the present day and we see some of the interaction between Martin and Megan, his wife, first of all, it's a very sweet relationship.
Very much.
Very tender. It's very clear these two love each other quite a bit. And we get this exchange where she's wishing him well and says, I hope you have a good time out on the golf course. And he's walking over to the closet and getting out his golf clubs and says, I love you and all this kind of thing. And he's picking up his clubs to go out and play. And meanwhile, in these narrative text boxes that aren't what Martin is saying, but rather his internal monologue as he's speaking to us, he's telling us, the reader, that I hate that I have to be lying to her. But whatever money I had saved up from my glory days as Deadeye's ran out a couple of years ago. And she's got these expensive medical bills I've got to live to, and I have taken a regular job. And she thinks we still have money, and she thinks I'm going out to play golf. I hate golf. But this golf bag, gets me out of the house. And we learn that he's working at, it's not called this, but obviously it's a Walmart type store, as a greeter. And he is there. It's kind of funny. He tells us, at first he got the job to sort of case the joint and figure out, when's cash moving in and out and when can I take this down as a score? Because I suppose the only real job this guy's ever known is to be a criminal. And after a while he realizes, well, because everybody does everything on credit card anymore, the cash value of any kind of heist he would do is going to be nominal.
Which is a really good contrast, right? To say not only has his life changed and evolved, right? So now society is. So his old way of doing business isn't going to be a good way of doing business.
Yeah, the game has maybe passed him by a little bit. And we'll see coming up as he starts to get back into the game a little bit how, there's some rust to be shaken off before he's really prime time ready.
Well, I'll tell you, Mark, here, when we left the scene, the tender scene, and he has a golf club, he's going to go out and play golf. Then you flip the page, and as you said, it talks about, I hate lying to her, and he's got to go to work. I'm thinking right there, before I went on to the Walmart kind of job, he's back doing his thing. He's robbing, he's breaking people's legs, he's killing people, and she just doesn't know about it. So it was another little twist in that, oh, wait a minute, he's not going out there doing those things. He's actually trying to hold down a real job, and he's got a very low-paying job, so it's just not covering all the expenses that he has. So I thought that was an interesting twist that went just, bang, bang, bang right away.
Sure, and I give Gerry Duggan a lot of credit for this, that this story, Deadeye's, fits into a genre that has its tropes. And so we have our own expectations about the guy might be wearing a mask, but it's a crime story. And so we have certain expectations that are built into our experiences of the telling of crime and heist stories. And there are a number of times where Duggan plays with those expectations or plays on those expectations and then just sort of twists things a little bit different.
Yeah. Does it make you think you're going to be nicer to the Walmart greeter when you go out now? This could be somebody just, passing time before he's going to go break your legs or poke your eyes out or whatever it is.
They say, you never really know what's going on in a person's life. And usually that's meaning that you're supposed to be more empathetic to other people because they could be dealing with struggles you don't know about. It might also be they're just barely holding back a monster.
Yes,
that could
exactly
be
right.
too.
That blue vest may not keep you safe.
Yeah, that's right. And funny enough, he makes the comment here that he stood there for a while in that greeter uniform to case the place, and then eventually realized, well, now I'm just working here.
Yeah.
It's no longer a ruse. It's now my life.
And he basically says, I came to rob it, but now they're actually robbing me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So as he's there at work this particular day, he sees a customer pushing a cart that is full of materials that are very familiar to him, maybe from his old life. So this cart has got a bottle of bleach, some goggles, a respirator mask, what I'm going to assume is like some lime or something like that, a handsaw, some other types of chemicals. Martin recognizes this immediately as the stuff that you would get when you're getting ready to dispose of a dead body.
So that customer you're talking about with the stuff in his cart, right?
Yeah.
Again, obviously, if you just saw that picture itself, you say, okay, he's a criminal. So,
Yeah.
they have played on some of the stereotypes to make their point real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other thing with the art, right? Where you don't have an opportunity to talk a lot about, paint the picture with the words. I loved, Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you go see the movies that we went and saw together when they first came out, the most interesting thing I was thinking about the movies was how did they capture the character, Tom Bombadil? Oh, that was such an interesting character in the books.
Yeah.
And they skipped over it.
Oh, I was heartbroken.
And I went, well, wait a minute.
No Tom Bombadil?
Yeah, and wait a minute. Now, the new series, they've gone backwards, as you know, and they actually have attempted to show him and play his thing. But again, the words can be really, really descriptive, paints a picture in your mind. So this takes that out of the equation. Here it is. This could be a mugshot from any night on television, right?
Yeah, this guy's got a bald head and a thick beard and kind of just a mean look on his face.
Looks like the wife. Without the beard.
Or the bald head.
Without the bald head, yeah. Mark, when I read this the second time, it
Yeah.
was after you had showed me something on the internet about some actual criminals' search on Google, right? One after the other, because here we go, right? He said he's too lazy to make multiple trips, right? Here we go. Here's all the stuff to, cut up a body, dispose of a body, kill all this kind of stuff in a cart at one time.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to share this video in the comments, or rather in the episode description for this podcast, because this video you're referring to has become my favorite video on the internet. And interestingly enough, it's a courtroom scene involving a prosecutor who has a very thick Boston accent, but the image is just, or the video camera is just trained on this man who is standing there in his orange jumpsuit with this look on his face of like being beaten over the head or something like that. And she is reading off, the prosecutor is, his internet searches and goes through, one at a time. It's like at 5:02 a.m., he searched how to dispose of a body if you really need to. At 6:10 a.m., he searched how to cut up a body and get rid of the DNA evidence, or whatever.
It's real life. Right?
Yeah, right.
Life.
And that's a real life video.
Yeah.
And this here, the tell that this guy has sort of given by purchasing all these items at once that he's got in his cart is, I'm trying to dispose of a body. So Martin sees this guy and what he's got in his cart and decides that he's going to do something about it. And so he takes a couple of steps to be able to identify this person, either to get his name or at least to find out where he lives or how he can follow him home. And he is going to put the Deadeye's mask back on for the first time in 20 years and take some action.
Which is interesting, Mark, because there's no motivation for it. I mean, as I'm reading, I'm thinking, okay, why is he stepping up to do this? Unless he's going to go rob them of something. And that's what I was, again, expecting.
Yeah.
And, spoiler alert, there's a twist.
Well, Dad, and this may be an issue with the storytelling, or it may be something that we're just not supposed to be able to know yet about this character. And this is where I wanted to talk to you about his motivations, because surely he's seen other people who were committing crimes over the last 20 years, but something about this day where maybe he's just started to settle back into this life of working a regular job. I say settle into it for the first time. And maybe he's thinking already about, hey, I need money anyway. Maybe it's time for me to put the mask back on. And so who knows? Maybe he sees an angle here. Maybe he sees if this guy's burying a body, probably there's been a robbery to go along with it, so I can rob the robbers. That's worked out for me before. Maybe it's some element of boredom that he started to get a taste of this, plain Jane regular life as a working man and doesn't like the way it feels. Or, I don't know, could it be like a righteousness of some kind that he just, when I had Peyton on for episode 2 of this podcast, and we talked about the book Criminal, and we were talking a little bit about the main character in that story, Leo Patterson. We joked about him being the type of criminal that has a code. And it does seem, although it's not well defined for us here, that Deadeye's does have some type of code, in that when he commits these crimes, like later we'll see, he's, saying, I'm just here for the insured government money when he's knocking off a bank, that he's not going to be stealing from working people, except vicariously through the insured deposits that are funded by our tax dollars. But he's not robbing working people directly. Although I did think it was interesting that they said one of his crimes was knocking off Fenway Park.
Yeah.
Because I would think, some things are probably sacred for the working man from Boston, and he seems to be kind of a blue-collar hero type robber character.
Well, again, so they're probably $10 hot dogs, which is ripping off the common people, right?
Okay.
This big corporation called Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
Because he had several other things, right? He's eventually going to show how the health insurance industry is evil. So we have a lot of big corporate evils going on.
Yeah.
But when I read this book the second time,
Yeah.
and if I'm jumping ahead, stop me.
That's okay.
But in the latter part of the book, it talks about what that nephew had done, and it was about slipping some drugs to some girls and all that kind of stuff. So I wondered if he's got some kind of vigilante kind of, mindset to this whole deal. That's kind of where I was. I didn't catch that the first time. The second time I did.
That's a fair point. And, with anything, once you get used to doing something, once you get used to living outside the rules a little bit, doing the next thing becomes easier. And I don't know, I sound like someone from your generation making a slippery slope argument or something like that. I was
just going to say I spend my life in regulations, Mark. So no, that's not true.
But
color within the lines, please.
Well, all the same, what I'm saying here, though, is once Martin Dobbs, as a younger man, had started to commit crimes, robberies and that sort of thing, and he got used to, hey, I may have to commit some acts of violence in the course of this, then committing other acts of violence becomes less of a dramatic thing for him, something that he's more comfortable doing. And that's kind of what I mean, that he's sort of, torn off that Band-Aid.
Sure.
And so maybe he said, hey, I see some other ills in the world. And maybe once in a while, Deadeye's job is to take out a predator.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly didn't call 911, say, follow this guy, I have a suspicion.
Right.
He went and took a little more direct approach to rectifying the situation.
He does, and so let's go there. Deadeye's has gotten this guy's address, goes to the house where he knows that this man who bought all these chemicals and supplies lives, and he goes into the house and he fights this guy in his kitchen. And as he goes in and he's fighting this guy who looks like a big, tough guy, and I should say, Martin Dobbs is a fit and healthy looking person, other than his hemorrhoids, I guess. Can't see those. But he doesn't look like some giant muscle man who would have a physical advantage. He's not going to be physically intimidating to anybody. He also, he's a brawler, but he's not like Batman, who is trained in, all the different martial arts of the earth and the world's greatest hand-to-hand fighter. He's just a dude who gets in a lot of street fights. And he's someone who doesn't have that, what would you call it, Dad? Maybe like a sense of self-preservation that would say, hey, this bald-headed guy with the beard who's bigger than me, this fight may not turn out the way I want it to, and I've broken into his house to do it. That like warning system doesn't seem to work for him.
Yeah, and as he approached that house that you were just talking about with the bad guy, he was the text box basically telling us, I'm kind of casing the joint. I'm trying to be cautious. I can't believe I'm back with the mask again. All those kind of things. So he clearly has rust.
Yeah,
and he knows it.
But he says, I feel 20 years younger once I put this mask on.
There
so there is something revitalizing about it for him.
Yeah, who wouldn't want to do that, though, right?
Of course. We all live out our vigilante fantasies, I suppose, in one way or another. So Deadeye's goes in and he's getting in a fight with this guy. And, he puts on a pair of brass knuckles and he punches the guy's arm with it and makes him drop this knife. And then, he's playing for keeps here. He, with his hand that doesn't have the brass knuckles, uses his knuckles to punch this man in the throat and, take him out of the fight immediately. And as this is happening, all of a sudden, boom, this shotgun blast hits the wall sort of right by him. And he didn't know that this man he was just taken down had a partner who was in the house. But, and I love this, the guy's coming down the stairs, he's fired the shotgun, and Deadeye's turns and looks up at him. And when he does, the guy sees the mask. And this is where Deadeye's is able to gain an advantage based on his reputation, where the guy says, oh no, it's you, it's Deadeye's. And this brief moment of pause that a man with a gun takes, Deadeye's uses to just knock his feet out from underneath him and bring him down to the floor and start, beating him down with a piece of wood that he just finds handy there. Really impressive exchange.
All of his fighting looks to be very, like he's done this a lot of times before, right? So I kind of thought he looked big too, though. You didn't think he looked as imposing. He looks really fit.
Fit, yeah. not model, swimsuit model kind of fit. But you're right. I mean, he's a fit, athletic-looking man.
You would say like I am, right? I mean,
That's right.
I'm not ripped, really, but close.
Well, I think of you as sort of more of like the male ideal. I think Da Vinci had you in mind, Dad, when he was.
Right?
I know. I guess he's older than you, right?
Oh, I just started thinking about the fact that we do like, sarcasm and those type of things. That's how we talk to each other with humor. So I detect that was sarcastic on your part.
Oh, is it? Well, we'll leave that to the reader's
I
interpretation.
know I'm slowing down, but I think that was.
This is our art, Dad, and the listeners can decide for themselves.
I see. Okay. We take a poll. See what happens.
So, anyway, after this fight concludes with both of these guys immobilized for the moment, Deadeyes smells something. And it's coming from like a crawl space, basically. And he opens this crawl space entryway. And he looks in, and what he finds are 3 women who are terrified and living in filth and have fly paper hanging from the ceiling with flies all stuck to it and everything. And he realizes he has stumbled upon not like a drug operation where there's going to be some money or drugs that I guess he could turn around and do whatever, sell or whatever, but rather he's walked into a human trafficking scenario. And his response to this is he's like, all right, I was going to just rough these guys up. They don't know who I am, but these guys die. Yeah. And of course, he proceeds to go back out into the hallway and murder both of these men.
So there's this twisted morality, right?
Yeah.
Where, he sees that trafficking situation, tremendous empathy for those women who have been trapped in this, and goes out and just, slices people up. And
that's right.
Kills them in revenge.
Uses a piece of wood to stab a guy through the chest to death.
And then is kind enough to call 911.
That's right. Changes back into his civilian attire and just drives away as the police officers are entering the scene. Well, he goes home to Megan, and Megan immediately knows something is going on. He talked earlier in his narrative to the reader about how he doesn't like lying to her. And it appears that he's also not very good at it. She knows right away that he's been working, and he tries to say, I should have told you sooner, but I took a job at the Walmart type store. And she says, there's blood coming out from under your sleeve. He says, that too. Yes. I'm also Deadeyes again. And she's mad.
Angry face again on the wife, for sure.
Yeah. Of course, she doesn't know that their financial situation is in the shape that it's in. She might have come to believe these news reports that, maybe she thinks that her husband has all this money tucked away somewhere, although he's always said to her that he doesn't, because, they joked about it before, that, they were living off that $10 million that they weren't, obviously. But in the midst of this disagreement between husband and wife, Megan starts coughing a little bit and then goes into a full-on seizure attack. She falls out of her wheelchair onto the floor. Martin dives down to the floor and calls 911. He's trying to hold her, and he's yelling right away for an ambulance to come. We're going to see how that progresses in issue 2, but we have one last page to tie up issue 1. And this page is set in Don DiGiolamo's office, and he's got a couple of his henchmen here, and it seems that the word has gotten out. We don't know exactly how, but the word has gotten out on the streets that Deadeyes is back. And they're talking about this crime, or these killings, I guess, that have taken place of breaking up this human trafficking operation. And Don DiGiolamo puts out the word to his men right here. If Deadeyes is back, he must have spent up all of my $12 million. And I want you to have some fun, find him, recover every dollar you can, and then Deadeyes dies a bad death. And so we end issue 1 with Deadeyes back in the life, whether he wanted to be for one night only or not. We end the issue with Deadeyes' wife being in a state of peril from her own medical condition, and then we also end with knowing, and maybe Deadeyes doesn't know, that there is a bounty on his head from the mob.
Yeah. Right away, I thought, when he called 911 when his wife had the seizure, I thought, man, they're going to get him. Right, because he already used the same phone to call 911 for the murder scene. And I've seen enough NCIS and know how you can tie these things together.
Dad, I think our author did too, because I'm pretty sure that Deadeyes picked up the other guy's phone
and
then Yep, and then he drops it on his way out the door, leaves it in the house.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that.
Yeah, I think he knows enough to know you don't use
Okay,
your
I see it on the
personal
floor
phone.
there now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Never mind.
Yeah, that's okay, Dad. I think some of this is probably going to reveal to us why I excelled in language and arts, and, you had to do math.
That could well be it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we open issue 2 with the hospital's billing director being in Megan's room while she's being treated, which I do think there is a very clear message that's laid on pretty thickly throughout this book of, yes, our medical system is ripping people off, and they are being painted as villains. I think maybe a little more mustache twirling on the page here than quite in real life, but certainly it makes the point. And so this billing director is saying, you got to make some decisions here about Megan's treatment, but also keep in mind that we expect payment at the time of service, which I don't think is typically how it goes in a hospital room. But, I guess I'll be thankful I haven't truly been in that position.
Neither have I.
And I love the way this is done in the comic book here. And this is the kind of thing that you can just do best in a comic, where she asks, "Sir, how will you be paying?" And then we get a page turn. And on the other side of that page, she asks, "Sir, how will you be paying?" And we get to the next page, and it's a picture of Deadeyes in his Deadeyes costume, holding up, I guess, probably a bank someplace.
Right.
And the first word that comes out of his mouth is "cash" with a big letters and a big exclamation point. And he's, telling whoever he's robbing at that moment in time that he's just there for the government-insured money. So, cough it up and nobody gets hurt. But I love that. He has decided he's going to have to go back to that quote-unquote work if he's going to be paying for her hospital bills.
And that one panel is very clever being put in it, because then they go right back to the scene where he's in the room with the billing person.
Yeah, it's not the next event that happens in the story.
Right.
It's just a flash.
Yep.
That tells us exactly what's going on.
Yep.
Well, we also, if the point hadn't been made clearly enough, we have this conversation for just a moment between Martin and Megan's roommate there in the hospital, who's talking about how, she looks at the bills and sometimes she knows she's being charged for treatments that she didn't get or tests that weren't ever taken, and, how they rip you off. And Martin goes, he never really breaks his cool ever in front of Megan. And he goes out of her room and walks down to the parking garage and inside his car. And this is where you see him holding his steering wheel and just screaming at the roof. And sitting next to him is this hospital bill for $67,000. And that's when he knows, I got to do it.
Yeah. And then they start with a little box about, on the 10th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me, right? So he starts going through that. And I thought that was a clever way of saying he's going to get the money.
Yep.
For his true love.
Yep.
And it may not be as nice as the song is.
That's true. No golden rings going on
No.
here. Well, where he goes next for his next stop is the home of his old wheelman, who coincidentally is named Wheels. And this is not a young guy by any means. He's probably at least in his 50s, maybe a little older. And Deadeyes shows up at his house and says, basically you ready to go back to work? And we learn from Wheels that his husband has medical bills of his own, and so they're kind of strapped for cash. And he's like, "So when do we go to work?" And I do love it when they don't have to twist somebody's arm for 2 issues to, bring them back into the fold. He's just like, let's do it.
And it starts out when they meet each other, Deadeyes is like, "Here's the 20. I go, a bet's a bet." So obviously when he retired,
Yep.
and his buddy Wheels, he was like, "No, I'm going to retire. I'm going straight." And it was like, "Yeah, right. I bet you $20 that doesn't last long." And here it is, years later, but nonetheless.
Yeah, he shows up with a $20 bill.
So there's his moral code again, right? Yeah. I owe you $20. Here's your $20.
That's right. Not gonna welch on the bet. Another thing that we kind of learn about this relationship is they obviously have an easy working relationship between Deadeyes and Wheels. But Deadeyes is not coming to Wheels' house as Martin. He's coming to his house as Deadeyes. And we'll hear later in a conversation between Martin and Megan that Wheels does not know his real identity. So however many times they've worked together in the past, Martin knows where Wheels lives. He goes to his house to find him, but he has kept that part of himself, his identity, beneath the Deadeyes mask as mysterious. Well, Deadeyes and Wheels start talking over what they're going to do. And Deadeyes says, "Hey, remember one of those banks that we struck 20 years ago? We're going to hit that one again." tomorrow.
Yeah, we don't need a plan. We already had a plan. It worked.
That's right. There was a plan. It worked. That's exactly right. And, Wheels' response is like, man, we gotta develop the plan. We gotta take some time. And Deadeyes is just like, I have to have this money now. We don't have time for that. And Wheels is like, let me go steal a car.
Right, yeah.
And he does. So the next day, we see Martin out on the street in the entire Deadeyes costume except for the mask. So it just appears to be a man in a business suit and a Scully cap, which I'm sure you can see walking around all over Boston. And he's kind of, looking, waiting for just the right moment. And then he steps back into the alley and he pulls on that Deadeyes mask and he walks into the bank and he starts his robbery.
Meanwhile, back in the car,
we've got Wheels in place. All he's got to do is wait there about, 10 minutes, 5 minutes maybe? But he looks under his driver's seat and he finds a bottle of vodka that I guess for luck he has always kind of carried with him on these heists. He pulls out the bottle and he takes a drink. We flash back to Deadeyes inside the bank. And he asks the bank manager, who's obviously the one in charge, do you remember me from 20 years ago? And the guy's like, yes. And Deadeyes is, so make sure your people understand I'm not playing when I say no die packs, no tracers or anything in this money. And of course, this terrified bank manager is like, do whatever Deadeyes says. This book reads really fast. This is kind of stepping out from the story just a second, but this book reads fast. I read through the 4 issues of this volume like 3 times over the course of the last week and a half or so, just to kind of make sure I was up on the story and not missing anything. And also because, frankly, it's enjoyable every time. But our creators here, our storytellers, use a lot of single splash pages, which, because the character design for Deadeyes is so cool, they always look good. Him standing on top of a desk with a shotgun as these bank employees load up a bag full of money. Or plenty of other pages where they just use like 3 panels, basically dividing the page into roughly thirds to tell the story. I mean, we see a whole bank robbery take place in the span of about 2 pages here, and it's done pretty economically. But John McCrea's art looks good. What did you think of, sort of the look of the art here?
I like this. These pages seem to be more clear. You could tell right away what was going on. Maybe because I know that, we know the scene, right? We've seen bank robberies before where you get up on a table or something with your gun and everybody's cowering around you in different corners of it. But yeah, very, very well done. Very easy to understand.
Yeah.
Even someone like me didn't get lost in it. I was able to find out exactly what they were doing.
Wow.
Yes.
I did pick the right book for you,
Yes,
Dad.
very, very good.
I ought to give you more books with pictures in the future.
I'll go back to the words.
So old Deadeyes is leaving out of the bank here, and he walks out, and he's like, where's Wheels? Where's the getaway car? And he sees it not primed right in front of the bank, but rather parked where he last saw it across the street from the bank. And so he's got to rush over there to the car, and he finds Wheels passed out in the front seat. And so he's not only not going to be driven away by his wheelman, but also slowed down a little bit by the fact that he's now got to push Wheels' body into the passenger seat, get himself behind the steering wheel, and start taking off. And, that's critical time while the police are surely on their way. And, we see represented through the lettering, the wee-oo, of the police sirens. So he takes off down the street, and he's got this unconscious Wheels in the seat next to him, and he's slapping him on the face, trying to wake him up, yelling to him. And as he's, driving fast through town, trying to get clear of this bank, all of a sudden he comes over a hill, and that bottle of vodka has another disastrous moment for the fate of Deadeyes, in that it rolls underneath the brake pedal out from under the seat. And so Deadeyes can't hit the brakes when he wants to. And he drives intersecting a T-train. And as you can imagine, when a car runs into a T-train wins. And Wheels has just awoken in time to see this crash about to happen. And he's not wearing a seatbelt because he's just been pushed over into that seat. And he gets ejected through the windshield, looking like a classic crash test dummy visual where we see from the side this arms not out to brace himself, just headfirst into the side of this T-train.
So 2 comments. First off, this is where I got, you read it and you're trying to focus. And then I read these stories, this part, and I thought, started thinking about you driving, learning how to drive, learning how to drive, right? And all these scenes came back to me. Well, I know how this plays out. This isn't going to go well. And then, sure enough, it did not go well. So, we'll just leave it at that.
Oh, well, I mean, Dad, I always put the bottle of vodka under the passenger seat.
Yeah.
I learned from these books, too.
I just remember your instructions to your sister when she was 3 years younger, right? So she's getting ready to learn how to drive, and you go, it's not a big deal. You just, you drive, you hit a few things, and you get better. And I thought, no, this is not the advice we're going to give. So I would agree, keep your vodka bottles away from the gas pedal and the brake pedal.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. But the way you're telling the story right now,
yeah,
right, and you're filling in the blanks and you're putting the narrative in there,
sure,
is the way I read books. So there's the difference between what you were saying. If that was all typed out and spruced up, I'd read that book and say, what a great story. Mm-hmm. It seemed like just genre is a lot of work.
For you, yeah.
For me, yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm a word-focused person, not a picture-focused person. But,
sure.
But yeah, so all the things you're saying are exactly true.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's right. And it does link together in these pictures. But I like a book, personally, that just flows with the story. So yeah, it's a great example of the way I'm reading the book and the way you're reading the book.
Sure.
So
I wonder, Dad, if you let the apostle here give you 7 more graphic novels, whether by the end of that you would just be so accustomed to it that you wouldn't have that sort of hang up, or whether you're just destined for the rest of your life to be incapable of reading one of these comic books.
It may well be. This may harken back to, I don't think my father's going to be very enthusiastic about all this. I don't know.
By the way, Dad, when I told you and Mom that I was going to start this podcast, I didn't say I'm quitting my job as a lawyer so I can start a comic book podcast. I just said I was starting one. And at least for now, and that is until some of you listeners get behind the podcast a little bit more, I'm going to have to keep having a day job. But hey, that's all right. I'm happy to do it. The apostle does this for the love of the game and to spread the good news of these great comic book stories.
Amen, brother.
Good. So to go to what happens next after this crash. Fortunately, Deadeyes is in pretty good shape. He gets out of the car. He realizes he can't just leave Wheels there. Morally, I think he realizes that. I don't know if on any other level he thinks it makes him more likely to get caught. I don't think so, because obviously Wheels doesn't know his identity. But he finds a homeless man in a nearby alley and negotiates to get his shopping cart from him that this guy had his possessions in. And he throws Wheels in the shopping cart and, still in his Deadeyes mask, runs Wheels all the way back to the emergency room at the hospital where Megan is staying. And he's still got all the money. He's got the loot in a backpack over his shoulders. And he pushes up Wheels in the shopping cart, basically to the first person, that he sees coming out of the ER and says, here, take care of this guy. And then he runs into the hospital. And I think this is pretty clever, where he says, police are going to hear about this. They're going to be expecting Deadeyes running away from the hospital. And how about let's not have anybody running away from the hospital? He ducks in, pulls off that Deadeyes mask, and he goes up to Megan's room and just goes to see her and visits with her for a little bit there.
Mark, there's a little bit of tension in Deadeyes in that scene you just described, right? So when he gets out of that car wreck, he says basically, I can't carry him and get out of here. And sorry, Wheels, and runs away.
He does. You're right.
And then as he's running, he sees the poor person there on the corner with the shopping cart. And so again, it gets back to this tension between his two personalities rolled into this one person.
Yep.
Stops and then negotiates the cart and goes back, into the scene of the crime, if you will, and extracts his friend. So
you're right. You're exactly right. And so, whatever that moral code that he has inside of him is, it overcomes that instinct for self-preservation to the extent that he has the instinct for self-preservation.
Right.
And so sure enough, he's loyal to his friend, runs him to the hospital. And then, obviously some time passes while Deadeyes is hanging out there in the hospital room with Megan. And meanwhile, on another floor of the hospital, we have Wheels in a hospital bed. He's, covered in bandages and all stitched up, and he's got, things strapped to him. And there are 3 men standing in his hospital room. And this is the last page of issue 2.
And they look like the classic mafia types, right? So it's the dark hair, the beards, the the burly bodies in suits.
That's right,
And then
all in
there's-
suits.
Then there's the one guy who's obviously the lower ranked mafia dude, right? He's in a jacket and a t-shirt and bald head, and he's going to be told he's got to do all the dirty work, but these guys are setting the tone.
And he's sort of got that like flattened nose that looks like
Yeah.
it's been broken a couple of times, you know?
Start thinking of the Dick Tracy movie, right? Just see some of those criminals and the lower level ones.
Yep, that's right. And so the man who seems to be in charge is standing at the foot of Wheels' bed here, and he says, "Can you hear me? We got questions about Deadeyes, and we ain't the cops." And so that ends our issue 2. We'll go back into issue 3 and we pick up at basically the same moment in time. Martin is being told that visiting hours are over, so he's got to leave. And as he's making his way out, and of course, once again, apparently this billing director is just hanging out in Megan's hospital room. And this time she won't give the roommate the Wi-Fi password because that's on the premium care tier.
Give me some more money.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And her insurance isn't paying for that. Well, on his way out of the hospital, Martin goes and he pays the bill for Megan, all in cash. And while he's there, he says, here's some more. Cut on the Wi-Fi and the TV for my wife's roommate as well. And so he has a little bit of that Robin Hood thing. Like, he didn't just set out to be able to pay everybody's bills, but once he saw the need, he was going to meet the need.
Exactly.
And he tries to, as casually as he can, just ask, like, "Hey, what's going on with that guy that came in the shopping cart a few hours ago? I heard something kind of wild about that." He gets whatever information he can, which I guess is pretty little out of this woman who's working at the desk at the hospital. But he's got another plan. He goes back into, looks like one of the hospital employee locker rooms.
Well, she had said that nurse or whatever she was, right? Wasn't much information, but she did say he's with his friends or in the room with him.
That's right, and it tips him off like
There's
he
something
shouldn't
going
have
on.
any friends in that
Well,
room.
that's what he
yeah.
says. He doesn't have any friends.
Yeah, that's right. He's Wheels. Wheels doesn't have friends.
Right.
So he goes into this employee hospital room and he dons like a surgical gown and a surgical mask and, one of those head covering type things that doctors will often wear. And he gets out his Deadeye's mask, I guess, so that he has it as well, although he's not putting it on. He's trying to look like a regular surgeon walking around this hospital. And he grabs up this tank as well that we're going to see in a second is a tank of laughing gas. Well, he walks into the room so that he can kind of size up the situation. That is the room where Wheels is being kept. And these 3 men are still bracing him. And Deadeyes comes in and says, "Hey, sorry, pardon me, gentlemen. Just got to take care of a few things here." And he's trying to, make little jokes with Wheels. And by the way, Wheels doesn't probably realize that this is Deadeyes. Maybe he recognizes the voice, the guy's build. But he's also in kind of a state of, wooziness or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think he knows either. Because, right, what does he say? Right, he says something along the lines of, "Hey, Doc, these guys aren't my friends." So he's trying to
Yeah, he
get
says,
help
"Look,
from
I
his doctor.
don't know these guys. Call
Right.
somebody else in, right?" Well, he tells Wheels, Deadeyes does, to just sit back and relax. And as he does, he reaches over and he turns on this canister of laughing gas, and the gas starts filling the room. Well, apparently he wasn't all that smooth, because he's no sooner departed the room that the lead guy looks over at the thug, the bald-headed, flat-nosed guy, and says, "Hey, that guy gave me the wrong vibe. You go find him and bring him back in here." And so that's going to lead to Deadeyes realizing that he's being followed, that the jig is up a little bit here, and he is going to end up having to fight this bald henchman there in the hospital. And he does in like an MRI room, and he uses the magnetism with the MRI to keep the guy pinned in place and all this. It's a funny scene, I guess, how it played out.
I thought it was, it's the old MRI trick, right? They're gonna have these scalpels come flying across the room, and
Right.
this gold chain chokes him back against the wall, all those kind of things. And you thought, well, that's pretty clever. Then you go right to the next old trick of the laughing gas, right? Filling up the room.
That's right. Well, and one thing with all those scalpels flying across the room at the magnetized henchman who's been taken out by Deadeyes here, going back to Gerry Duggan needing to go just a little bit over the top too. One of those scalpels flies directly into the guy's eye socket, and you see blood coming out of the eye and all that. So just a little bit gorier than it needed to be, but it made it humorous.
It didn't kill him, right? He says, "Stay here until the cops come." Of course, he's pinned to the wall with a scalpel in his eye. So
Sure
don't
enough.
go anywhere.
So from this, it's now time to ditch that surgeon kind of costume that he's put on and to go back into the Deadeyes persona. and he goes back into Wheels' room where Wheels and the two mafia guys are just laughing their heads off. I don't know if laughing gas really works quite like this.
It did with the Three Stooges. So
Okay.
it must be.
Well, then I think it's fair to say, so a documentary you saw called Three Stooges.
Yes, worked.
That's right. So these guys are sort of beside themselves laughing, which makes them not quite ready for Deadeyes to come into the room. And the joke he makes when he comes in is, "Lie down or I'll kill you all." Sure enough, Deadeyes then has this knockdown, drag-out fight with the two mafioso guys. He's swinging around that tank that the laughing gas is in, using it to hit one of the guys in the face. Actually, kind of brutal once again. He's crushing this guy's skull with it. Well, from there, he grabs up Wheels, runs him out of the hospital, and we'd been told that the mafia guys had a private ambulance that was going to come and take Wheels away to some place where they could question him further, I guess.
He got that info from the guy pinned against the wall.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Dad. And so he runs outside to that private ambulance, and he's got Wheels, and you can kind of see they're in shadow a little bit as he's running to the ambulance, but he's got Wheels in a wheelchair, and then he's got another body on there as well. It's one of the mafiosa guys. And he puts him in the back of the ambulance with Wheels, who's now sort of regained his senses a little bit, and he tells Wheels to tie the guy up. So they've got, I don't know, hostage, I guess, too.
Right.
So Deadeyes goes over to Wheels' house and drops him back off to the care of his husband. And, the guy's just happy to see Wheels alive. Well, Deadeyes takes his leave at this time. He drives off in the ambulance, and this is where we get some plot development that's going to set up issue 4 and kind of turn our focus a little bit. We have this interview in the back of the ambulance where Deadeyes is now driven off, I guess, in kind of to the middle of nowhere, where they're not going to be heard. And the mafia guy realizes, I accept that you're going to kill me. And they start kind of having this conversation about the guy wants to know about the $10 million and Deadeyes taking down that $10 million heist and all this kind of thing. And Deadeyes tells him, "I never took down that score." And the guy says, "Well, didn't you whack the Don's nephew? You were seen leaving the scene that night when he died." And the guy says, "Yeah, I killed the nephew, but that didn't have anything to do with money." He says that I had learned, and this is one of the things you alluded to earlier. He said, "I had learned that this, nephew of the Don was slipping Mickeys to women and assaulting them, and he did that to someone I cared about. And so he had to be dealt with." And so sure enough, it shows it's the same flashback, or it appears to be a flashback to the same fight that we'd seen back in issue 1 when he was remembering old times in the 90s. And he is punching out and ultimately shooting in the head, this guy who is the nephew of the Don.
And I like it has the big words blam, right? And
Yes.
in red letters. And earlier on it had, spluck or some kind of thing when it hits him on the head. And all I could think of was the Batman, the old TV series Batman thing.
Yeah.
Kapow and all that thing. So it does have a little bit of that sprinkled in. But the bulk of the artwork is good. I mean, it's not cartoonish, if you will.
That's right.
But it's not cartoonish. It's trying to depict what's actually going on between these two men.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's made for children.
Right.
Like it's cartoony in the classic sense.
Right.
But yeah, you do have the the blam that is. I guess it's just something that I accept. It's always kind of part of the art form here, used in comics. So we have kind of these admissions back and forth between Deadeyes and the mafioso here, and Deadeye says, "No, I never stole that money. Yes, I did kill the nephew." And we learn that the connection here is that, so within the mob circles, it's kind of accepted that we think the nephew actually ripped off the family. And then the theory is Deadeyes, who killed the nephew, must have ripped off the nephew. And Deadeyes is like, "I didn't know anything about that." And so some light bulbs start going off in this thug guy's head. And he says, if that's the case, I bet I know where that money is, because it's never resurfaced. Mm-hmm. And he explains that he used to run a construction crew, and at some point, the family assigned the nephew to go work on this construction site. And he says, this isn't one of those quote-unquote no-show jobs. This guy actually had to show up and hang sheetrock, and it was some building they were converting from a college dorm to condos. Like higher-end condos. And he's like, look, I will tell you where this building is, where you can probably find that money stashed behind the sheetrock if you will agree to give half the money to my soon-to-be widow. Because he knows Deadeyes, I know you're going to kill me. And they have sort of this like, Deadeye says, how do you know that I'm actually going to do that I'm going to give this money to your wife? And he sort of realized, they're living by the same kind of thieves' code here, right? And he says, if you will lift up that mask and show me your face and look me in the eyes and tell me you're going to do it, then I accept you're going to do it. And that's exactly what happens. He shows him his face. The thug says where the money is, and then we get another blam.
Yeah. The other interesting part here is that, calling him the thug here, he also knew that his life was worth nothing. So either Deadeyes was going to kill him or his boss was going to kill him because if I show up as the only one without my head caved in,
yep,
I'm going to get killed. So he says, I'm a dead man.
Yeah.
So again, a little bit of honor here amongst these really crooked people. Give half the money to my wife.
Yeah.
And then I'll let you in on the secret here where this stuff is.
Yep, sure enough. And so our issue ends with Deadeyes after a big blam walking away from this ambulance and leaving it behind with presumably the dead body of this mafia guy in it. And that wraps up issue 3. We move into our last chapter, our last issue that is included in this volume 1. And it starts out with this very funny scene outside of a police station. You hear all this dog barking stuff, and you kind of look to the back, and it almost looks like some kind of dog pound or something like that. But it turns out this is a canine training center. There are 2 officers in there, and one of them is just sitting on this stool crying. And he's so upset because he can't believe that someone would have broken into the police station overnight and stolen his police dog. This officer who's crying says, the circuit was bypassed on the telephone pole outside, and so the security alarms were down. And he says, I'm sorry I was such a mess. It's just he was such a good boy.
Yeah.
And what more sympathetic character is there than a dog, by the way?
So it looks like, he's almost like some kind of guard or something like that. Because the police car...
Or a trainer, like a civilian trainer.
Yeah. Yeah, but he's a mess, right? He's upset about the dog. Little does he know what he should be upset about.
That's right. Well, and the officer who's interviewing him says, I guess somebody really needs to find some drugs. And the guy who's there crying says, well, that's just the weird thing about it. This dog was trained to find currency. And so now it makes sense to us why Deadeyes would have stolen this dog in the middle of the night.
You think he had Google? It had to be, right? Something to look up. How do I find, cash behind a sheetrock wall? Oh, a currency dog. Yeah. I mean, Maggie can sniff out treats. That's about it. It's not very far along in the training.
Yeah, that's the formerly incarcerated Maggie, I should say as well. She came through the Arkansas Pause in Prison program, where she was trained to be a very good dog.
She is.
Anyway, this dog is now in the hands of one Martin Dobbs, who is not dressed as Deadeyes, but rather is wearing some sunglasses and a fake mustache, and he is dressed as like a pest control guy.
Pest control, yeah.
Right. And he goes into the lobby of this condo building, and he goes to the concierge or whatever who's working there at the desk, and he says to him, hey, I've got an appointment. I'm supposed to be in here to, this dog is trained to sniff out bed bugs. And, it's kind of this was something that I really loved in the movie Ocean's 11, where they use these different, subtle manipulations to get past security or to get past somebody, to convince someone to break their procedures or their rules or whatever. And here, this guy's like, I don't show any work order that I'm supposed to give you access, to this room. But as soon as Martin Dobbs starts talking about bed bugs and how, I think you guys are infested in front of some of the residents, suddenly this guy's like, let me give you a tour.
Two little ladies, which looks like they could be tough.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Two tough ladies.
Let's take care of this for sure, sir.
So they immediately start going around the condo. And at some point, the dog hits on a spot on the wall. And so he starts whining and barking and scratching at the wall. And at this point, the concierge is sort of realizing that, something's not right here. And first of all, there aren't bed bugs in our wall, if there are at all. And so starting to realize that something is up, he has his back turned for just a second because he's looking at the dog. And so Martin here hits him over the head with his flashlight and knocks him out, and then just immediately goes to work. And so, by the way, that's another one of those things where I wanted to talk about with Deadeyes, where, it might be that he's stealing from the mafia and he's stealing from health insurance companies or, whatever, robbing banks. stealing from the rich, but he doesn't care about assaulting an everyday citizen in the course of that, and maybe hurting them pretty bad in some cases.
Just the means justify the ends, right?
That's right.
He's got a one-track mind.
Well, for him, that is exactly right. And so he reaches down into this bag that he's got with him, and he pulls out a table saw. And he starts running that table saw along the wall and cutting this hole in the wall. And just as he gets this open, pulls away this panel of sheetrock and finds Eureka. There are 2 bags stuffed with cash behind the wall. And he pulls it out, and what should happen except the nearby elevator opens and 2 people get off, who I'm going to assume are residents of this condo.
I would think so, yes.
And these aren't just any residents of the condo, but these are 2 people in their karate gis who are coming home from karate class or taekwondo or whatever.
HOA provided, yes.
And immediately they are ready to start putting these skills to use and, do a hi-ya of some kind. And so this one guy starts throwing a punch at Deadeye's because he knows, something's wrong that's going on here. And this is where, I alluded earlier to Gerry Duggan really liking to go over the top. And I got to tell you, in issue 3 of volume 2, there is another fight scene that takes place that is just... It's one of the grossest fight scenes and at the same time hilarious fight scenes I've ever seen. And we get some taste of that here as well, because as this guy is throwing a punch at Deadeye's, he just holds up his table saw, and this man's fist goes straight into the blade of a running table saw, and he pulls his hand back, and he's got fingers missing and blood coming out everywhere. Oh my goodness. And, then he just turns and he throws a kick into this guy's chest, and meanwhile, the other person in their karate uniform is going to attack Deadeye's from behind, and so Deadeye's turns the table saw on them and starts cutting them up. Well, in the course of this, one of those bags of money breaks open, and there are dollars flying all over, and I'm going to guess these are, higher demarcation bills, hundreds and all that kind of stuff are flying all over the place. And now these people really want to know what's going on. And I will say, Deadeye's is a pragmatist, if nothing else. He says, look, we could continue to have this table saw fight if you guys want, but if you will just agree, you will take this bag that has spilled out all over the place of money here, which we'll know should be about $6 million, and forget that you ever saw me and clean up this mess yourself, and you've got nothing to say to anybody about this. You keep that 1 bag of money. I'll take this other bag.
I was surprised they didn't kill him at that stage, because what was the point, other than it showed, even though I'll kill anybody, I really don't want to kill, I don't need to kill you, so you're not part of the plan.
Well, think about this, though. The people we've seen him kill are people running a human trafficking operation.
Yeah, it's true.
We've seen him kill mafia people, somebody who's committing sexual assault. We've seen him just knock out or kick the teeth out of or whatever people who are, I'll just say civilians, people who are not involved in the criminal life. So I would think that's what's going on here.
So you can saw off the fingers and the arms of civilians and leave them in misery. Or to kill the bad guys. I get it.
You gotta have a code, Dad.
I get it.
By the way, this is a problem that a lot of people have with Batman as well. Batman's always got this, I don't kill, and I won't let any of my Robins kill in the course of the work they're doing in Gotham City. But people are always pointing out, yeah, but you probably just put that man in a coma. We get that he's not dead, but okay, you went pretty far with him, though.
My problem with the Batman TV shows anywhere was these are the just most idiotic bad guys, right? You have them, you tied them up, you're not going to kill him. You're trying to kill him, right? I'm not going to shoot you.
Yeah.
I'm going to hang you over a pool of, sharks, and I'm going to leave the room.
Right. Well, it's the James Bond problem.
Yes, exactly right. It's just kill him if that's what you're going to do. But they always have some very absurd way of letting him get out of it. It's always got his utility belt is still on him.
Yeah.
All those crazy things.
If you've dedicated your life to the riddle, then maybe there should be a puzzle of some kind that goes along with your killing.
Yeah.
It's got to be fun.
Yes. So, Mark, there's one part that you skipped over.
Oh, please.
And it goes from when we're talking about he's in the lobby with the concierge guy. Mm-hmm. And before they go upstairs and cut the hole in the wall,
yeah,
it flashes back to the hospital.
Yep.
With Maggie being there and basically...
Maggie's my dog.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, okay. Eating a treat. No. So, she's there finding out more and more people are, just upset with the billing that's going on, and she's becoming buddies with all her hospital rehab friends down there. So it's kind of interesting. That will play in later on in the movie. Not a big part of where you.
Well, that's all right, and not even much later on, really, because once this fight is done, and our man Deadeyes is driving away with $6 million, he's going to play Santa Claus a little bit. He delivers a big sack of money to Wheels and his husband. That's going to take care of any medical expenses that Wheels has from his accident, but also those mounting bills that had been referred to earlier that the husband has. He goes and he pays off the medical bills for his wife, and then she asks at one point, can we pay for the bills of some of these other folks too that I met in here as well? And he agrees to do it. So, yeah, he is going to spread the wealth around a little bit, put that money back into the community. Well, Deadeyes is also good to his word. Maybe he doesn't have, I guess we got to figure out how we're going to define half, because he doesn't have half of the original $12 million to give, even if he wanted to give every penny he had to the widow. But let's say half less expenses.
Half of what he had.
That's right. And so he goes to this woman's house, and he's now dressed as Deadeyes again. And she kind of immediately, upon seeing Deadeyes, knows this doesn't look good for my husband. And he tells her, your husband wanted you to have this. And he throws a bag of money at her feet. And she says, he's not coming home, is he? And, Deadeye says, no, he's not. And she says, did you shoot him? And Deadeye tells her, yes, I did. And meanwhile, he sort of turns his back to her a little bit. He's standing in the entryway of her house, and he's looking at some framed pictures, including this framed picture of her late husband and the Don. And in this photo, something catches Deadeye's eye in the background. And we won't know it for several pages, but what it is that catches his eye is that in a frame behind the Don and the late husband is a painting. And this is a real-life painting by Rembrandt called Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee.
This had me confused. I was going to ask you about this part. Like, okay, what's up with the two guys just standing there with the arm each other? Okay, they're friends.
Yeah.
Or is there more? What's going on? I didn't get how this tied into the very end where it talks about these famous paintings. So thank you. I did not recognize that.
Yeah, well, and this is going to lead us into volume 2. So let's get back to that in just one second. Because at the moment that he first looks more carefully at this framed picture on the wall, there is no reason why we should know that there's something about the background. But Deadeyes kind of pauses a moment and he asks her, when was this photo taken? And the wife is like, who cares? You killed my husband. And while he's got his attention on this photo, the wife, a sweet woman, pulls a knife out of her purse and slashes his arm.
A shiv comes out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, this poor distraught woman.
But by the way, to go back to Deadeyes and whatever his code is of who he'll, hit and who he won't do physical violence to, he turns around and just backhands this woman and knocks her to the floor. So hitting a woman is not out of bounds, at least if she has attacked him for Deadeyes. So Deadeyes turns to this woman now, who's laying on the floor, and he says to her, I wish you hadn't cut me, because now my DNA is all over the place. And the woman's like, maybe she's thinking he's going to kill me. And she says, look, I can clean it up. It's not a problem. Well, Deadeyes does two things. One is he grabs that photograph off the wall and tucks it into his coat. And then the other thing is he says, I've got a better idea. And as we go on to the next page, we see the woman tied to a tree out in the front yard, and the entire house is ablaze. And I suppose that's one good way to get rid of some DNA, is to burn the whole house down. She's yelling and screaming at Deadeyes, who's just kind of calmly standing there. And she says, my husband bought me this house. And he says, well, he also left you a bunch of money that you can buy a new one. And she yells out, it's Christmas Eve. And he says, well, maybe Santa will bring you a fire extinguisher. Which I thought was such a good line that like it had to be included.
Yeah, I didn't notice that he had taken that picture, that's the same one from the earlier scene. So it's okay. So some of the pieces are coming up, and that was very subtle.
Yes.
At least I read the thing twice and didn't see it. So that may just be my ignorance in how to look at these books, but I did not.
I mean, Dad, I think there are a lot of things you talk about, like Easter eggs in the movies, that are put there for fans to be like, oh, I know that character in the background from Star Wars or, whatever. I mean, it really is sort of an Easter egg that's laid here, that why would anyone notice or tie much significance to the fact that Deadeyes took this photograph? It might be so he can better identify the Don, and he's going to go after him in the next, adventure or whatever. So we haven't tied any significance to that picture yet in the book. Well, Deadeyes goes home, and I probably ought to go back to referring to him as Martin again, because this is Martin in his Christmas sweater with a penguin and a Santa hat on it, and he's back in his house with his wife, and they're talking, and he's done a little bit more narration for us, and we're reading in those narration boxes where he says, hey, maybe it's time for the Dobbs family to start thinking about moving up in the world, and, what if I could just do one last job and retire for good this time? Well, while that's going on, he has taken that photo back out again, and he's looking at it a little more carefully. And he says to his wife, they never found the paintings from the Gardner heist, did they? And he's punching in a search into his phone, Gardner heist reward. And we also see this other photo in the background. It looks like a wedding photo with Deadeyes and his wife, who appears to be standing in the photo. So right. I kind of wonder whether the assault that the nephew had done was the assault on.
That's what I thought.
Wife.
I thought that myself.
It's never made explicit, but I think we can infer that probably. And it shows a picture frame in the back of that photo as well, the picture of...
Oh, it does.
But what do you notice about that picture frame?
It's empty.
It's an empty picture frame hanging on the wall behind Martin and Megan Dobbs on their wedding day.
At that museum, apparently. Or
right.
At that. So, yes.
Well, so what we see here as we go on, to the next page, he's getting some information back on his phone. It says, Hub Museum victim of largest private heist in history. Frames to remain empty until the pieces are returned. $10 million reward. And on the last page of this volume, Martin says to his wife, maybe we ought to go back on Boxing Day, so a couple of days from now, and get a little nostalgic, and why don't we visit the place where we were hitched? And on the very last panel at the bottom, it says next. This is also something that lets you know the series is coming back, even though we've concluded our story here. And it says next, the empty frames.
Interesting. And right in that same scene, talking to the wife, she starts going back to, do we have any extra money? I've got some friends that have some problems. Going back to the scene at the hospital where they're being overcharged, right? So she's all in as far as let's get some money to help. But yeah, okay. So I thought that was clever, the way they have set it up for a continuation. It's like so many movies that you see where you have a trail leading to something else. Oh, it's going to be a continued. The next episode is going to be a continued episode. Very clever.
But get this, Dad. And so first of all, they kind of left, they leave that hanging there, right? We've opened up the door for our next story. And then the comic goes away for 4 years and now comes back. And I had luckily picked up a copy of the first volume and read it just shortly before the new volume came out. And I've been reading the new volume in single issues, and it has been so fun so far.
Oh, cool.
I'm really enjoying it. But, and by the way, it is also one that, even though it's a continuation of this story, you could pick it up without having read this first volume. And, there'd be background you don't have, but you could enjoy it just as it is. But that Gardner heist that he's referring to, so I'm going to read to you right now from the website for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts.
A real place, or?
A real place.
Okay.
The 1990 theft of 13 works of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum's collection remains unsolved, although the museum's commitment to resolving the crime has never diminished since its occurrence 33 years ago. The museum, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office are still seeking viable leads that could result in safe return of the art. The museum is offering a $10 million reward for information leading directly to the safe return of the stolen works. And it puts in parentheses, a share of the reward would be given in exchange for information leading to the restitution of any portion of the works. A separate reward of $100,000 is being offered for the return of the Napoleonic eagle finial, which I guess is like a flag, that was also stolen at the same time. Anyone with information about the stolen artwork should contact the Gardner Museum directly. Confidentiality is assured, and it gives some contact information. And then it has a little section that says, see the works. And you can look at the 13 works that were stolen. So in real life, this is like the largest unsolved art heist ever.
So you're sure that part's real?
100%, Dad.
So can we call? Can we get in on this? We know where they are.
It's a Don Giolamos.
We know where they are.
Yeah, right.
Easy Street.
Dad, I'm looking at this here. There's a Manet, a Vermeer, and that painting that I referred to earlier, Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, that is one of the paintings that was stolen.
Interesting.
And in real life, 5 of those paintings were not just stolen, like somebody picked them up off the wall and ran them out, but the frames that they were in were damaged and taken off the walls, and either the paintings were cut with like a box cutter out of the frames, or they had found a way to pry the frames open and left them there. And so the Gardner Museum, for those 5 works out of the 13, has the empty frames hanging on the walls. And you can go see them. And so in this photo from sometime after 1990 of Deadeyes and his wife at their wedding, you see the empty frame in the background.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
And so now we know, well, next time we're going to have to steal from the mafia again.
This is not a good thing.
But isn't that cool?
It is very cool. I didn't recognize the name of an art museum. That just shows I was an engineer. What do I know about art? It's interesting. Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So, Dad, there is, and this is something I just, in getting ready for this episode, I discovered, kind of doing a little internet research. This art heist has launched a whole bunch of different like crime fiction novels and things that have centered around this, of different, people with their characters who might have stolen the art. And there's apparently a documentary series on Netflix about the theft of the art and the investigation that's gone into it so far. And I can't wait to go and watch that now.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that neat?
Yeah, it is cool. So, Mark, I think a finial is almost like a mortise. It's a carving.
Okay.
It's decorative. Almost, you see sometimes like in an archway or in a doorway, it would be like up in the corner with some decorations on it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Like maybe a lot of them might be like a fleur-de-lis or something like that.
Sure. It could be, angels, or you go to some places in Europe and they have those into the side of some of these great big churches there where they have carved these things on the side of the wall. So like they're like reliefs from the wall. It's pretty neat.
Well, how cool. So, Dad, you knew something I didn't. Apparently, I was wrong. I thought it was like a flag or a banner of some kind.
So that's an interesting statement, Dad. You knew something that I didn't know. Like this, this is new to you.
You've known me my whole life. Has this ever happened?
Maybe once.
Hey, Dad, this has been awesome. This has been a cool way to spend New Year's Eve, too, sitting down recording this with you. I love coming out here to see you and Mom, and of course, Kelly, my good sister, and her family here in North Carolina. And it's been a really cool couple of days. Thank you for sitting down doing this with me.
No problem. What do you pay your guests on the show, by the way?
Well, it depends how many downloads they get.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Karen, get their downloads going.
Yeah, well, we did one with Mom the last time I was out here to visit, and she hadn't hit that royalty mark yet, so she's still working off her advance, and I imagine you are too.
So I'm not competitive at all, but count the downloads that she got and give it some time after you put this out, and I want to see, because I think we're going to bust right through that number.
Good. Well, that sounds good. How about this? We'll put this out here for our listeners. If you liked my mom better, hey, send her episode to all your friends and get them to listen to it too, so her numbers go up. If you liked my dad better, and I suspect you didn't, but if you did...
Wow. All right. Yes.
Hey, Dad, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. A lot of fun.
I'm sure. I'm sure you're thrilled.
Ready to do 2 more of these.
Well, maybe once Deadeyes Volume 2 comes out in trade, I'll have a reason to come back and see you.
I'd rather do that than maybe some of the other ones that I've seen.
So we'll leave it at that. And so to all of our listeners, thank you for being with us once again.
And I will keep on reading those comic books.
Hey, all right.
I do listen.